Thank you to our panel. I'm just going to have a few opening remarks here. I'm a little nostalgic. This is my third time up here and my last for this conference. It's been quite an experience this past week, and the energy, I think, around the entire building and complex, you can feel there's momentum and we're moving in a great direction. So let me just say how excited I am to be here today, and really thank you to the Climate Registry and the Georgetown Climate Center for hosting this event and for all the work that we've done with you, our shared partnership across the country. It really means so much to us to have partners like you really help us lead the way in this space. President Obama has put forth an ambitious plan to reduce carbon pollution and put the United States on a path toward a clean energy economy. As you've probably heard repeatedly, under his leadership, wind has tripled and solar has increased 30-fold, and the Clean Power Plan is on its way to help clean our air, cut emissions, and save more than $50 billion in environmental and health-related costs in the process. But one of the unique things about this COP and what we're doing in terms of our overall plan in this space is the partnership and leadership that we have with the states and local communities. I mean, I don't know if you guys have heard it, but over and over again, we hear from our communications folks and others about how impressed they are by the leadership from local communities. The term subnationals, I think we've been asked to figure out a better term for next time, but so the presence of subnationals is such a new thing that we don't even have the vernacular correct. But it really is a dynamic showing that we're not going to wait to act, that the need is so strong and has been identified by local communities so clearly that action is happening regardless of political debates, regardless even of what the outcome is here. We are taking leadership action all the way from the local level, mayors, governors, all the way up to Washington, D.C. Some of the examples of that, if you look at the state of California, the state has taken aggressive actions to combat climate change, and you'll hear more from the panel about those actions, which have really set California. I mean, if California were a country, it would be one of the fourth largest countries in the world. So the fact that California has set up such an ambitious system is really informing decisions around the world. Also, thanks to local leadership from mayors to Governor Brown and close collaboration with stakeholders, the state has developed and sped up water infrastructure investments to help provide assistance to farmers and ranchers. And though there's still a lot more work to be done in this space, and this is really setting us on a path to lead in the drought area as well. Another example in Maryland is the Coast Smart Communities program, which connects local planners to information, tools, people, grants, so that they can learn from each other and really assist communities in responding to the impacts of climate change. And finally, when it comes to answering the president's call to reduce carbon pollution and leave a better planet for future generations, states such as those that are a part of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative have long been setting an example. We refer to it more frequently as RGGI. Since 2011, the regional cap and trade system has added $1.3 billion in economic activity to the 9 participating states, while also reducing emissions by 15%. In addition to cutting pollution and stimulating the economy, RGGI has cut electricity rates, saving consumers, residential businesses, and public users hundreds of millions of dollars. So there's that proof that you can both cut carbon pollution and reduce costs at the same time if you get the system right. This successful model for carbon pollution, or for cutting carbon pollution, is one that many states are looking to as they start to plan and set their own state plans under the Clean Power Plan. Today, you'll have the opportunity to hear directly from states including California, Vermont, New York, Washington, and Colorado about their initiatives and opportunities and challenges that they have faced in building resilience and transitioning to a low-carbon energy future. And thanks again, really, to Vicki Arroyo, who will join me here on the stage in a minute, to the Georgetown Climate Center for really leading the way on the state action, most recently releasing a report and working with states to reduce carbon pollution from the transportation sector, which will be our next big challenge to face together once we get back to Washington, D.C. So I really look forward to this conversation, learning from all of your incredible leadership at each of your levels, and thank you, Vicki, for all that you've done.
Thank you, Christy, for your wonderful leadership and to the Obama administration for their wonderful leadership on this issue of climate change. Welcome to this panel, probably the final panel that many of us are doing today, woohoo, on subnational leadership. And I think we've got a panel that probably doesn't need an introduction, but I will provide brief introductions. First, Mary Nichols, the chair of the California Air Resources Board, a post that she's held since 2007, but of course, she had this job many years back. She's also been assistant administrator of air for EPA, has won many awards, has taught at UCLA Law. Welcome, Mary Nichols, please. We're also so pleased to have join us from the great state of New York, Richard Kaufman, who joined the administration of Governor Cuomo in 2013 as New York's first energy czar, where he leads all aspects of the state's energy policies, agencies, and authorities. He was going to talk about reforming the energy vision there, and before that, he's been a senior advisor to DOE and also was one of the CEOs of a large private equity fund specializing in clean energy before that. So welcome, Richard. Deb Markowitz was appointed Secretary of Vermont's Agency for Natural Resources in 2011, and she's the chair of the Vermont Climate Cabinet. She's represented Vermont on the White House State, Local, and Tribal Leaders Task Force on Adaptation. She's very involved in RGGI and in the Transportation and Climate Initiative, which Christy mentioned, and we'll talk about that today. She's also a former statewide elected official in Vermont, Secretary of State, and a Georgetown Law alum, so we're especially pleased to have her. Chris Davis joined Washington State Governor Inslee's administration in 2014 as Senior Advisor for Energy and Carbon Markets, and his portfolio includes clean energy, greenhouse gas emission reduction, and the use of market-based mechanisms to reduce carbon pollution. He's recently led the governor's Carbon Emissions Reduction Task Force, a 25-member stakeholder advisory group. Welcome, Chris. And finally, last but not least, is Bill Ritter. He's founder and director of the Center for the New Energy Economy at Colorado State University, but of course many of you know him as Colorado's 41st governor who built consensus around some of the big challenges, including climate change and the need for more clean energy. So thank you for being here, Governor Ritter. So we're going to hop right into it because we have a brief time, and I'm just going to do a round of questions here to get the conversation started. There's one mic, so that encourages people to talk one at a time. Mary? California's been a leader. Everybody knows the history, certainly, of California's leadership under the Clean Air Act. But there's also a lot of new announcements coming out, it seems like every week from California, everything from ZEV leadership statements that are happening. Can you tell us, what's new in California and what can we look forward to coming out of the COP at that sub-national level in California and with your partners?
Well, my governor left this morning, so God knows what will be waiting for me when I get back by way of new assignments. But we are fired up with energy coming out of this COP. We're anticipating a good agreement, and we're expecting that as a result of that, there will be a lot of opportunity for us to both work at home and to collaborate with other states and other subnationals and even nationals on some of these issues to implement the Paris Accord, I guess is what it will be called. So here in Paris, we've been meeting with people literally from all over the world, but some of the major highlights of our activities are around zero-emission vehicles and certainly around looking at carbon pricing programs in other places. With respect to the vehicle program, we have been very aggressive in pushing for the worldwide auto industry to take the issue of manufacturing battery electrics and fuel cell vehicles and advanced hybrids as a serious responsibility. We have a mandate. We're the only U.S. state, as most people know, who have the ability to adopt that kind of law, and we've been doing it now for a number of years. At the federal level, of course, we're collaborating with U.S. EPA in a review of the standards that the Obama administration has adopted, which don't explicitly speak to zero-emission vehicles. But as we look ahead to 2025, 2030, and beyond at what is going to be a major effort of all of our lifetimes, really, and beyond, to transform our system of moving ourselves and our stuff around, which is a very important basis for our economy. We have to be thinking about how to make our systems more efficient and cleaner. We have some good examples of what can be done, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. So that's going to be certainly a major focus. And then another important outcome here has been discussions about cap and trade programs or market-based programs, what they are, what they look like, what they could look like. We are certainly advocates for carbon pricing, but we are pretty agnostic and also open to learning about whether there are better ways of doing this than what we're doing. And we went through the exercise of creating a cap and trade program, which is now international because we partner with the Canadian province of Quebec, and we're working towards including 2 other Canadian provinces, Ontario and Manitoba. But we're having discussions with other jurisdictions about what linkage could look like, what that means. And what we're finding, as you would expect, is that every state has its own unique set of interests and challenges in working in this space, and we're trying to figure out what the basis for linkage would be that could benefit all of us, but at the same time not slow down progress that's already being made. I mean, the great thing about states is that they do compete with each other, but they also collaborate, and we can find ways to do both of those things. And I think I'll let others describe some of that. Thanks.
Perfect. So thank you, Mary. So Richard, your governor actually mentioned potentially linking with some other states and also announced some new ambitious clean energy goals for New York. Can you share that information?
Sure. I'd like to give a report from the sub-nation of New York. I think maybe a better way of describing states, building on what Mary said, is that Judge Brandeis of the Supreme Court talked about states being the laboratories of democracy. And so we're all kind of wrestling with a set of common problems, how to make progress against our emission targets, how to grow our economies, how to attract people to live in our states, how to respond to what people want. And increasingly, people want to have more control over their energy. So under Governor Cuomo's leadership, we do have a number of aggressive objectives that we've set out for ourselves. We've long been a founding member of RGGI, but more recently, we have a state plan that calls for a 40% reduction in carbon emissions over 1990 by 2030, and a clean energy standard which calls for 50% renewable energy by 2030, and that does not include nuclear power. And we have Governor just signed the Under 2 MOU. So we're quite confident that we can achieve these objectives by a focus on 2 things, and that's what we call REV, Reforming the Energy Vision. And the two areas of focus I want to just touch on briefly. One relates to regulatory reform in the electric utility sector, and the other relates to, because we can get more value out of our electricity bill. And the second is how we think about support programs that we use at the state, because we spend $1 billion a year supporting clean energy, and we can get more value out of that too. So just in terms of on the regulatory side, the thing about the electricity sector is it's not only very energy inefficient, it's incredibly capital inefficient. So the average capacity utilization in New York of the system is 54%. And I don't think it's very different in most places. It's built for the hottest couple of hours or days of the year, but we pay for it all year long. And it's really quite astonishing, because when you look at sort of the history of global business in the last 35 years, it's really one of the chapters in that history, it's a very exciting history, I know, has been improvement in capital efficiency. And through adoption of new technology, changes in business model, and changes in financial incentives. And this has not come to the electricity sector. And it's largely because we haven't really changed the rules about how utilities get paid. In fact, They get paid largely for committing a capital, which is in the opposite, as it were, of the direction of history. So given a choice, for example, between investing in a pole or investing in a piece of software, they'll invest in a pole because a pole is capital and software cannot be capitalized, as a simple example. So we know actually that we can make these changes because we've begun to do it. So in part of New York City and Brooklyn and Queens, there's load growth, and under business as usual, the utility would have spent over $1 billion to build a new substation, and instead, under our new policy, the utility went out, Con Ed, to their credit, went out to the market with the problem of load growth and asked the market to come back with solutions, and what came back was a range of solutions that included solar, on-site generation from CHP, demand response, and energy efficiency that's only going to cost $200 million. So all customers will benefit because there are hundreds of millions of dollars of less capital spent. All customers will benefit because there'll be less peak power purchased, and it will be cleaner. So we know this can be done. It's exposing the utility sector to the same kind of innovation that's happened around it. And then on the support program, quickly, again, we spend $1 billion a year to support clean energy. 80% of that is in the form of one-time grants that support projects that are kind of bolted on to the system that's already incredibly capital inefficient. And we inadequately distinguish between support of the whole project and really thinking about soft costs, because the state can't influence hard costs, but we can influence soft costs of customer origination or financing costs. And so we are directing our support programs to enable markets as opposed to being the market. So when you add it all together, we're talking about driving capital towards really building that energy system of the future that we've all seen pictures of, rather than it being this sort of mainframe-looking world. It's a hybrid network system, and that's going to create more affordability, more value for customers, more choice, more resiliency, and it'll be cleaner too.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Richard. So Deb, Vermont recently set an aggressive new renewable target, and you have other important targets on the books, and you're also working as part of regional collaborations, both RGGI, which Christy mentioned, and also the Transportation Climate Initiative. What's the importance of regional collaboration for a smaller state, but a leading state like Vermont?
Well, thanks for that question. You know, for those of you who aren't from the U.S., Vermont is this small state, very rural, 650,000 people. Sometimes people think we're actually part of Canada because we're just south of Quebec. Some Vermonters would be happy, actually, to join Quebec because of their healthcare system. But that being said, I get this question all the time from Vermonters. Like, why are we even bothering? We're such a small drop in the bucket. You know, why should we be doing anything on climate change? And the answer, of course, and coming out of this COP, I'm sure you'd all agree, is that we have to be all hands on deck. And as a practical matter, what I explain to them is that as a small state, we're nimble. We can innovate in a way that some of the larger actors, because of the bureaucracies in a larger state, can't. And so, for example, we have an electric efficiency utility that's a model for the country, Efficiency Vermont, and now it's the Vermont Energy it's VEIC, Vermont Electric. I wish my husband works there and I can't remember the acronym. I think I haven't seen him it's been a long COP. It's been a long conference. It's Vermont Energy Investment Corporation. Now I can go home. And in addition, you know, we've been able to deploy renewable energies. We're up to about 30% renewable energy. And at the same time, in these last 4 years, we've had 3 different reductions in rates. So for us, we can be innovative, but there's also a limit to what we can do on our own. We don't drive a market the way California or New York does. And so we feel very lucky to have leading states to kind of grab onto the coattails from. We feel really lucky that we've got Georgetown Climate Center with their Transportation Climate Initiative and some of their other convenings on resilience and adaptation as well, and looking at how we're going to be deploying electric vehicles across the Northeast Corridor. That's important to us because we can't go it alone. We have been involved in RGGI from the beginning, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. That's brought in, it's over $3 billion to our economies over the past 6 years, which is significant, and has made a serious difference in Vermont, while reducing greenhouse gases by 40%, so that's meaningful. We've joined the ZEV Memorandum of Understanding. We're a part of that alliance, and we're working very hard through the Transportation Climate Initiative and with Quebec as well, with the Green Corridor, to put in place the infrastructure that will allow consumers to choose an electric vehicle with some comfort. Our big challenge, though, going forward is transportation fuels. And that's because, Vermont's a rural state. We've got, as I just mentioned, a relatively green electric sector. Just about 50% of our greenhouse gases comes from the transportation sector. We don't have the mass for mass transit to be a really easy thing to put in place in Vermont. And so that means we need to think about technological advances. So for us, in addition to focusing on deploying electric vehicles, we're also very much interested in grabbing the coattails of my neighbor in New York, who's thinking about, how can we get involved with California with a market-based system for transportation and heating fuels. I think that's the next question for all of us. Again, RGGI's been successful as an inter-jurisdictional program, and we're hoping to innovate in a way that we have the option for these additional fuels.
Thank you so much, Deb. So if you could pass the mic to Chris Davis from Washington State. Governor Inslee was here. Governor Shumlin's been here. Governor Brown's been here. It's just wonderful to see this leadership from so many current and former governors. Governor Inslee actually has taken it upon himself to move forward with a cap. There have been some challenges to legislation in Washington State, but he's moving forward with that leadership. And I know that you also participate and lead some regional collaboration. So can you tell us what's happening in Washington, please, Chris?
Sure. Thanks, Vicki. And I just want to say thank you very much for convening this and for helping out those of us in the States to get here and participate. I don't think there are many of us who probably would not be here, not for you to hear help, so thank you. It's fun to be on this to get a sense of sort of in what ways the various states are different from each other and similar. Washington is in some ways, interestingly, anomalous. I think much of the conversations here on the Clean Power Plan and certainly in the broader environment that we are in are talking about emissions and emissions reductions from the power sector, it being most often the largest source of emissions. And in that score in Washington State, the story is really quite good. We are beneficiaries of a legacy of hydroelectric development in Washington State that have led to Washington really contributing as much as 20 to 25% of all the nation's renewables across the country. 70% of the power consumed in Washington State is carbon-free now. And so we have a great asset in the form of low-carbon electricity already in the state, which nevertheless is not something we've stood on the laurels on. We have an RPS program that calls upon the state by 2020 to increase renewables by an extra 15%. And that's going quite well. In 2001, we had no industrial utility scale wind, and we are, with Oregon combined, because of our shared Columbia Gorge development, up to 4,800 megawatts now of significant wind developed in a very short time. And solar, given the prices, is in spite of Washington's stereotypically gloomy weather, climbing quickly as well. So energy efficiency, too, is a big hallmark in Washington State. We spend across our utilities as part of our renewable portfolio standard almost $500 million a year in energy efficiency. Our Northwest Power Planning Council, which is a wonderfully enlightened and yet oddly Soviet body that does a 5-year plan on power forecasting in the state, has looked forward and tells us that we have well within the ability of meeting future load demand through 2030 through conservation. roughly 800 megawatts likely to be generated in conservation through 2030, which can fuel some 500,000 homes a year. So on the energy score, we feel like we're quite good, like Vermont and like many other states. When we stand back and look at Washington, the real challenge for us in terms of our ability to do our part to contribute to Paris and to contribute to the ever-strengthening goals of reductions that are coming out of agreements like this is to tackle the transportation sector. And if we look at carbon pricing programs around the world, very few of them have done that. Mary's program, I think, is notable in that sense, coming in a couple years after they started. Europe has not yet, and like many other places, we are all scratching our head, I think, in some ways, trying to think about how to creatively and effectively tackle emissions coming out of the transportation sector. And so this past year has been an exciting one for us. While the governor tried for the second time in Washington State to bring a cap and trade legislation to the legislature that would lead us on a path to eventually merge potentially with the California-Quebec program. We were unfortunately unsuccessful with that. Those of you who know my boss and the governor know that he has a passing interest and enthusiasm in this topic, and was not to be deterred by the lack of progress in the legislature. And so in some ways, taking a page from the president's book, he issued in July a directive to his Department of Ecology to implement a rule within the authority he has under our State Clean Air Act to cap and limit carbon emissions across the state. So we are currently in the process of rulemaking on that. It is a program that would cover about 60% of the state's emissions, roughly about 40 to 45 entities who include both some of the larger stationary sources across the state, but most notably also include our 5 major refineries and the fuels which are both refined and then combusted in our transportation system in Washington. So in general, people don't think of Washington as a oil and gas state, but we do have 5 major refineries that bring oil and gas from both Alaska and Canada and the Bakken area in. And so this is a big center for this. It's a big challenge. The draft rule will actually be out next week. So the governor was sort of pulled about half of his team with him to Paris, and the other half stayed and toiled. And so you can see which lucky side of the coin I was on for that. But we will have a rule out next week, which will be the first sort of cut at defining the mechanics of how this program would work. It would be a capped program that would come down over time. We do anticipate some mechanisms of trading and have started to have conversations with Mary's agency and a few others about how, in spite of the lack of this being a full-blown carbon cap and trade program because of the limits circumscribed by the Clean Air Act, we might still yet be able to create iterative sort of early steps of linkage opportunities to other programs. So happy to talk a little bit more about what that might look like, but that's kind of the current path that we're on in the current events happening in Washington.
Thank you so much, Chris. So Governor Ritter, you led a state that passed a Clean Air, Clean Jobs Act and many renewables policies, and you, like our center, convene around the Clean Power Plan, red states and blue states. I'd love to hear your take on how to make this issue, climate and clean energy, a more bipartisan issue again. Many of us over the years have noticed that leadership at the state level, even at the federal level, that used to be more bipartisan, has seemed to have waned. Can you give us some reason for optimism?
Yeah, I do. I did notice that all the governors represented here, the states represented, are led by Democratic governors, and one might get the idea that the states are like Congress, which is totally stalemated over any kind of new comprehensive energy and environmental policy. But it's not true. There are places where the legislatures or even the governor are sort of pushing back hard, but there's some other good news. And so 2 parts to it. One, there are a variety of states that aren't really about this transition because of climate change, but they're about the transition because of opportunity. So we've seen Governor Sandoval in Nevada, a good Republican, look at this and say, we're not building another coal-fired plant. And by the way, we'd love someday to export clean power into California and become part of the import market, maybe part of an import-export market if we extend the imbalance market that's now CAISO, but extend that broadly across the West. Governor Ducey in Arizona is also looking at this and saying there's opportunity. It's a very sunny state. There's plenty of solar. And he wants to attract solar jobs and has done some things to actually bring in companies that are interested in solar power into Arizona. And so those are two examples. But Governor Snyder in Michigan has announced a clean energy plan, but also that he will implement the Clean Power Plan. So he's a Republican. So we see this happening. I convene right now 13 states in the West, North Dakota, South Dakota, and every state sort of west of that. Washington, California have both been involved in those convenings, and we convene 24 utilities from the West. Now, interesting about that convening, there are 8 Republican governors and 5 Democratic governors that are a part of it, 1 independent, Governor Walker from Alaska. And then, you know, there are states that have actually sued the EPA, suing over the Clean Power Plan, but they're all there trying to understand if they lose their litigation, what does implementation look like in the West? You can imagine, because there are states that are heavy coal states, so Wyoming is the biggest coal producer in the nation among the 50 states, but Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, they have the 3 strictest targets for what they have to hit by 2030, and so they're really interested, I suppose, in the litigation first, but again, understanding they could well lose that litigation. If they lose that litigation, they're looking for some path to be able to implement the Clean Power Plan without their economy sort of going over the cliff. Part of that's economic diversification. The other part of it is looking to this group of other states and saying, is there some way for us to partner with you either in a bilateral way or in a multi-state regional agreement, or even partner across regions like the Southeast or some of the states you're working with, Vicki, and really ensure that we can get to where we need to get to under the Clean Power Plan, but do so without sort of busting the economy. And the good news is, at that level, those sort of second tier of conversations, so this is not with the elected officials, but with their appointees, when we get behind closed doors, we have really constructive talks about what 2030 can look like and about how that implementation can happen in spite of sort of, you know, some of the things that are said about it publicly. It's on my part, reason for optimism. Okay. And this isn't just me in across the country. I think convenings like yours, Vicki, at Georgetown, the Duke Institute, or Nicholas Institute at Duke, and the Great Plains Institute in Minneapolis, we cover all but 5 states in terms of the convenings and the ability to sort of get there. And there's the sort of middle states, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Nebraska. Those states have been working on trying to figure out how they go forward on implementation. They're just not part of these regional convenings. So there is good news. And I think the litigation, at the end of the day, I think the Supreme Court's going to uphold the Clean Power Plan, and we're going to get a 32% reduction by 2030 because of it.
That's, wow. I love hearing that. And, you know, I almost want to end on that great optimistic note, but okay. I'm also looking, or almost there. I'm also looking at these folks representing states that have really suffered impacts already of climate change. I mean, California's drought, New York, Superstorm Sandy, Irene in Vermont, the Washington State, you know, acidification and loss of snowpack, fires in Colorado. And I'm assuming that that's at least part of the reason why it's important to have a subnational presence, because in spite of all the leadership that you just expressed on mitigation, it's obviously not enough without this meeting being successful. The negotiators who are working and toiling away and exhausted more than we are. Why is it so important that you're here to give a message to this audience? Mary?
Well, California is a very large state with a big economy, and we brag about that. But we are also a very small portion of global emissions, somewhere a little bit above 1%, as most recently calculated. And we are very well aware of the fact that there's already enough carbon dioxide in the atmosphere so that changes are happening. They're underway. We've seen them. That's part of what motivated us to become so involved in the climate change issue early on, was work that was done at the Scripps Institute in San Diego that showed what was actually happening to the Sierra snowpack before the effects of the drought became so prominent. That was really what drove us in the beginning to get involved in AB 32. So we don't talk a lot about adaptation, although we know it's a reality that we're going to be living with climate change for a long time to come. And although we do pride ourselves on leadership in many areas that involve the emissions side, the technology side, when it comes to managing our water resources, California was the last state in the West to adopt any kind of groundwater management, and we're just beginning now to implement that program. And we know we have a lot to learn from other parts of the world. In the past couple of years, we've had a number of our leaders visiting Australia in particular, because they went through a horrific drought and implemented some very progressive measures to deal with it, and we hope to learn from them. So this is one of those situations where, because we are dealing with a global environmental crisis, California needs to be part of the world, not only as a giver of advice, but as a recipient as well.
Well, New York has already experienced the effects of extreme weather. In fact, that's how I got my job. Because after Superstorm Sandy, the governor called me and said, leave Washington, come back to New York, because the utility industry is in the age of the vinyl record at the time of the iPod. Because he could see that it took forever to restore power, and that utilities were using paper to find critical pieces of infrastructure. So it's not just, it's across the state that communities have been devastated. And so I'll just tell a little story here of something that we did as a kind of experiment. So after Sandy, Irene, and Lee, there are a number of big storms that have happened in New York. Communities have been trying to redevelop, and we heard from several communities that they were interested in having more control over their energy. They didn't know exactly what it was, but they wanted more control. So we decided to have a prize, a $40 million community grid prize, and it was going to be bigger than a microgrid. And we thought we'd get a couple communities that would put forward a proposal, and the $40 million wasn't enough to build out one of these community grids, but it would be enough to do the feasibility. And instead of 25 proposals, we got 125 proposals, and we're funding 83. And the interesting thing is that we constrain the competition so that all these communities are proposing things in areas of grid challenges. So not only will these grids have the ability to island in the event of an emergency, but they'll be able to perform services to the grid the rest of the time. So I guess what I would say here is that subnationals, cities, companies, people are ready to move on with this transition. And much of the future energy system for hundreds of millions of people is also going to be very distributed as well. So I guess what I would say is sort of form follows function. It's not a surprise that you're hearing so much from subnationals, is because we're feeling it from below.
Thank you. Great point. Deb.
Well, you know, a lot of folks have forgotten about Tropical Storm and Hurricane Irene, because Sandy came shortly afterwards and really eclipsed it, because it impacted so many states in such a significant way. But to remind you, Tropical Storm Irene hit Vermont. It was in 2011 in August, and it destroyed roads and infrastructure, buildings, homes, businesses in 225 of 250 towns in Vermont. So almost every single community in Vermont was impacted. My offices were wiped out. We're first responders, and our offices, 650 of my employees lost everything in their offices, computer systems down, papers down. It's hard to have a COP plan, you know, your continuity of operations plan, if you don't have it in paper, because you can't get into the building, it's been washed out, and you can't turn on the computer. We discovered a little problem there. But I guess you'll hear stories from each one of us, and the message is that It's the states, it's the big cities where the rubber meets the road. We have to respond to citizens. We've got to protect them. We've got to give them consumer, choices for, how they're going to drive or get their electricity. We need to make sure that as we're building, we control land use decisions, that we're building in a way that will be safe for future generations, and that we're protecting nature. Because indeed, we know in Vermont that nature has got to be part of the solution. And, to the extent that you're lucky like us in Vermont and in many places and in the states of the folks sitting here where you've got natural infrastructure, you have nature that can provide a protective role. You need to do what you can to preserve it. And so I would say it's very important that subnationals are part of this conversation, because we're where the rubber meets the road, both with the impacts, but also with the solutions. The nations can come to an agreement, and I certainly expect and hope that they'll come to a strong agreement that'll drive national policy. But at the end of the day, it's our communities where we're implementing it. It's our state programs that have to be responsive and to make it work. So it's very exciting to be here. I think it's really important that we're here as well. So I add my thanks for the Georgetown Climate Center and making it possible for us to be participating.
Thank you. And Chris, not only you, but as I mentioned, and Deb, but your governors and Mary's governor were here. And governors are busy people. So why did Governor Inslee and why did your team come, you and your colleague Sarah Rees?
I'll just 2 quick points on it. There was a day in August this past summer where I was with the governor in Eastern Washington. We took off on his plane after he went to view talked to some folks that were in a fire situation. We had, in 2014, the single largest fires Washington State had ever seen, only to be eclipsed by 2015's fires, which burned more than 1 million acres in the state. And in that day, he flew over the fires. We flew down south before crossing over the Cascades along the Columbia River, where 2 days earlier, scientists had revealed that almost 500,000 salmon had died as a result of warm tributaries that couldn't actually host salmon. We flew up over the Cascades, where there's a series of reservoirs, all of which capture snowpack and feed the major metropolitan areas in the west side of the state, the vast majority of which were empty after 2 or 3 years of drought. And we landed in Puget Sound, where the Dungeness crab and the razor clam crab fishery were closed because of domoic acid, which is a byproduct of acidifying waters in the state. Had we continued on to the coast, we would have landed in Forks, tiny little town that some of you who are vampire fans might be aware of, which gets a small amount of 255 inches of rain a year, one of the wettest places in North America, which was seeing forest fires this year for the first time in 150 years of known history of the area. So the impacts of climate are actually not so much in dispute at the moment in Washington. There's more than sufficient immediate ways that people across the area are feeling it. I think one of the things that happens from coming to an event like this is, in spite of those things, one of the kinds of headwind that I think we hear most often is, as some of the quotes that Mary said, Washington isn't a very, very big contributor to the problem, apparently. We are a small slice of the overall worldwide emissions. And in truth, we all are. There aren't very many jurisdictions anywhere in the world that have a notably significant contribution to the problem, and yet that's one of the pieces of arguments that we frequently hear about why Washington shouldn't be taking action on this. But when you come here and you link with other subnational players and you begin to talk about what happens when you accumulate the effects of many of these actors coming together, tying their programs together, assuming the same kinds of accounting systems, adding their contributions together, it becomes very difficult to deny that actual individual action at the level of this scale that we all represent here does in fact make a difference, and that's a huge part of why we're here for this week.
Thank you. So, Bill Ritter, give us reason for optimism in the face of all these changes.
A little bit different tack on why it's important for states to be here.
Thank you.
In a federal system, local, state, federal government work together on a variety of topics. State electricity regulation that's the place where it happens, far more than at the federal level, and actually far more than at the local level, although there are a lot of municipalities doing really important things. But I think it's important for us to be here because we have a story to tell where there is actually a fight. I mean, this is a transition, and any transition is going to involve incumbents looking at their own sort of assets and saying, how do we protect our assets no matter how inefficient they are? They're our assets. We want to protect them. And we have all these good news stories to tell. I mean, I had a fight. I signed 57 pieces of clean energy legislation, but there were people who fought against us. They said it's going to increase your rates. They said you can't integrate 30% renewable into your system. They said, you know, you will not get to the place of reducing the kinds of emissions that you're talking about. There's no reason you shouldn't have a climate action plan because it's going to ruin the economy. None of that was true. None of that turned out to be true, and so it's not just important to tell that on the national stage, it's important to tell that on the global stage, because this fight around incumbency isn't just happening in America. It's happening in other places as well, and to be able to say, no, these are not false choices. You can actually clean up the economy and grow the economy at the same time and protect ratepayers, you know, and do it in an equitable way. There are a bunch of states that have that story to tell, so that's why I think it's good for subnationals to be here.
No, thank you. And I will say, having been here for a week and a half, I have been so impressed by the number of companies, cities, state leaders, regional leaders from around the world who've come to tell those stories, and those stories of a win for environment and a win for their economies, I think do really give hope that people will see this narrative as a false one, as a false choice between environment and economy that we often hear back at home. So I want to open the floor to questions. Ashley has the mic here. So if you could identify yourself and speak into the mic. I think Jujin right there in the middle.
Okay. In the back there?
Yes.
Okay,
please.
great. And let's go ahead and take two and let the panelists answer, because we only have 10 minutes, so I want to see how far that gets us, okay? Great. And so is there another question? One in the back. Okay, middle in the back. Just introduce yourself. It's on.
Hi. Hi, my name is Jujin. I am a consultant from Korea. I also served in the Korean delegation a couple of years back. And above all, I am a recent Georgetown grad.
We're very proud of Jujin.
Yeah. I have two questions, actually. Maybe I might be taking all the questions. Number one, does your state constituents consider the fire in Washington, the fires in California, or Hurricane Sandy, Irene, as something relevant to climate change? That's my first question. And number two, how do you think your efforts at state level will affect the national level efforts, such as the Clean Power Plan? I understand that U.S. has had complexities with the form of Waxman-Markey Act or things like that. I just wanted to know how this will help national efforts. Thank you.
Great, and hold your thoughts on that one, and we'll get one last question.
What's a realistic roadmap for a zero carbon future for the states? I mean, with your political problems, let's not go into those, but like transport, energy, and agriculture, how long will that take you to get there, and how will you do it?
What's your name?
Marcus Stewart, I'm a filmmaker.
So you have 3 questions to answer. You could choose whichever ones, and then answer one and pass the mic down.
I'll just start really quick. We've had big forest fires. Interesting, they have not been in the place where we have pine beetle kill. We have 4 million acres of trees that have died from pine beetle kill. It absolutely has caused people in Colorado to understand the link between dead forests and climate change.
Good.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't think that anyone, at least no one in our administration, points to a fire and says that's climate change happening before your eyes. But the size, scale, frequency of these kinds of events are illustrative of the things that all the models tell us we're going to see more of. And I think that becomes powerful for people when you are an irrigator or you are on a cherry orchard and you're ripping those kinds of things out of the ground, because we don't have the water to irrigate them anymore.
I guess in response to that particular question, I just want to say that leadership really matters. And we've experienced that. When the president started his second term talking about climate change, it was a watershed moment for the issue. Because the more you have governors and secretaries and commissioners and presidents talking about climate change and making the link, the more our constituencies see those links. In Vermont, we're a land-based economy. People know we've had climate change before there's a disaster, because frankly, I can grow peppers. I mean, and I can grow artichokes. That's bizarre. I mean, we're in the north. We've changed our zone for gardening. We can, we have Lyme's disease. Those ticks didn't used to be able to survive the winter. So there's no question there's been a change. It takes the leaders to make that link, and then it takes us to even be bolder to then move it to action.
So I'll take maybe a couple of the other questions. So I think first, in terms of the Clean Power Plan, one of the great things about the Clean Power Plan, as Governor Ritter said, is that it really goes to the states to implement. And so we have this great experiment going on with different states. They're trying to figure out what they're going to do that's consistent with local conditions. And so I think we can be very pleased about the prospects for states coming up with solutions and finding collaborations for getting things done. So why don't I stop there?
So we are planning not for quite a zero carbon future, but for a very much reduced carbon future. California has in place a legal requirement to cut our emissions to 40% below 1990 levels by 2030 and to 80% by 2050. And my agency, the Air Resources Board, is responsible for writing those plans. We talk about this in terms of transition, and I think the public in California, at least, is very well aware of the fact that we are living in a time of transition, that the future is not about oil, and it's not about petroleum, and it's not about combustion, that the future is about clean ways of generating electricity and powering the economy. It's about more efficient cities and better ways of moving ourselves around. And people are excited about the opportunity to be a part of it. Our job as government officials is to help provide the wherewithal, the structures in which the people can do that. I very much agree with Richard's comments about where the energy for this is coming from. It isn't coming from the top. We need the recognition at the top and the leadership to help mobilize those actions. But we're seeing a tremendous amount of interest and involvement whenever we hold a workshop of any kind on, any of our schemes for low carbon fuels or zero emission vehicles or renewable energy. We see hundreds of people, entrepreneurs, individuals, private citizens, academics, teachers, community colleges, kids, coming forward, cities competing for the Green Cities prizes, all of those things. And these are not gimmicks. It's not just some sort of a campaign that you do on a one-time basis. I think people actually are aware of the fact that these are changes that we're all involved in, and they don't want to pay too much. They don't want their lives to be changed in ways that are too abrupt or unpleasant, but at the same time, they see the opportunity there. So I think when Governor Brown talks about these issues as a 77-year-old governor, but with a lifetime of commitment and family's commitment to California, people understand that he is really speaking on their behalf and on behalf of their kids.
Well, thank you all for speaking with us today and for your leadership. Please join me in thanking this wonderful panel. And thank you all for coming and for being such an attentive audience.